Norton, a Republican strategist and former senior official at the Department of Homeland Security, who's in Washington. Very good afternoon to you. How explosive are you expecting this testimony to be this afternoon, if at all?
Well, you know, it was rumored that Barnum and Bailey Circus was going to close their doors last month, but it seems they have one last stop here in D.C., and that last show is today. So I think it's going to be quite a show with a lot of fear. I think we've already heard some of his leaked testimony last night, referring to conversations that he had with President Trump, in the Oval Office in the February-April timeframe. And so I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the former director to disclose some of his conversations that he had with President Trump, and we'll see how far he goes. I mean, this is essentially going to set up a he said, she said type situation, unless there is, in fact, some sort of recordings that actually happened in the White House.
Do you think he will go farther than he's gone in the released testimony so far? Because what is important in that, about all the criticism, there's no claim that there was obstruction of justice, which is the impeachment issue.
Well, I think that there is a lot of jumping to conclusions. I think some of the one or two fringe House Democrat members that are pushing impeachment are just that. They're a little bit fringe at this point. There are only 2 members out of the 435 in the House. And I think that, obstruction of justice is a term that's being thrown around a lot here in the spring. But, as you said, there's a lot that goes along with that. And if there was just some sort of conversation or discussion about something happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that the president was trying to influence, the director at this point, or, what exactly the investigation was. We really don't even know how deep the investigation was with former National Security Director Flynn. So I think there's still a lot of details. There's 2 parts. Public part, and there's also a classified part. So we are going to hear some from the former director. It'll be interesting to see how much he's willing to disclose. Despite the fact that he is a former director, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's allowed to disclose information. He's still under security clearance requirements where you have to withhold some information. So, there could be some leaks in the classified testimony, as we've seen many times here over the last couple of weeks. So definitely a lot's going to happen and be packaged into the next couple hours.
Well, I mean, you would expect him to be pushed on this idea, again, that's mentioned in this testimony that's been released, about President Trump demanding loyalty from James Comey. Now, that is extraordinary, isn't it?
It's extraordinary in the sense that perhaps they had that type of conversation, but the reality is the FBI director, along with every other agency head, whether it's law enforcement, national security, or, the head of the EPA, serve at the pleasure of the president. When you serve at the pleasure of the president, you're essentially a political appointee, which is also another form of loyalty. These 3,000 appointees throughout the administration, any administration, are essentially the ones that carry out the policy of the sitting president, and those folks come and go. And so I think along those lines, it's not necessarily unusual, and I think that we need to remember that James Comey is probably one of the biggest lightning rods we've had in national politics in several decades. And, he doesn't necessarily have any friends on the Republican side, but also remember on the Democratic side, there's many, including Hillary Clinton, who have talked about it quite a bit just last week, blaming James Comey for her, her loss. And so I think for President Trump to try to clarify and understand exactly if they're on the same page going forward, not just on the Flynn investigation, but overall, I mean, let's just remember the FBI job has a lot of responsibilities, and the FBI director, is in charge of counterterrorism, is in charge of all these crimes throughout the country, and so I think from that perspective, it's not that unusual.
Talking to a US political expert about an hour or so ago, and he was saying that the problem with this is that the pressure building up in this way, and with this being the most watched thing on television in the States, since all the presidential debates and what have you, that we're going to reach a tipping point soon where the Republicans are simply going to turn away from Donald Trump in their very big numbers.
Well, I'm not necessarily sure that all the Republicans are with Donald Trump to begin with. Donald Trump is a president who doesn't necessarily have a set ideology, and a lot of Democrats voted for Donald Trump to put him in office, and so I'm not sure that's necessarily his main problem. I think his biggest challenge is going to be moving his agenda, moving tax reform, healthcare reform, dealing with some of these foreign policy challenges like North Korea, which seems to be an issue every day, like ISIS, like the terror attacks that have happened not only in the UK but across Europe, which are horrific, and trying to put a coalition together and work with allies. So there's a lot of things on the plate for him. I think that overall, a tipping point. I'm not really sure we're there yet. I think the troubling part is the 2016 election really has never ended, and that we still seem to be in this kind of election mudslinging, throwing back and forth. And it's going to be important not only for Republicans, but for Democrats to also achieve something here in the short term. Because, I think if they think that they're just going to walk into the, majorities in the House and Senate in 2018, I think, they need to think again because, overall, the reason Donald Trump got elected was the frustration in Washington and the fact that nothing's gotten done. So there's a lot here to digest, and there's a lot of moving parts, not just the Comey, but, overall the environment here in the U.S. when it comes to Washington, D.C. So I think we need to just kind of see this play out a little bit longer.
Okay, James Norton, good to talk to you. Thank you.